On the morning of March 4, 2022, a successful Utah businessman named Eric Richins was found dead in the bedroom of his million-dollar home. His wife, Kouri Richins, told investigators she had surprised him with a Moscow Mule cocktail after celebrating the closing of a luxury home deal. She said they shared a quiet evening together before she went to check on one of their 3 young sons. When she returned hours later, Eric was cold to the touch. At first, it looked like another heartbreaking tragedy. A healthy husband, a grieving wife. 3 children who had suddenly lost their father. But just 1 year later, that same grieving widow would stand in front of television cameras promoting a children's book she had written about coping with loss. The book was titled, "Are You With Me?" She said she wrote it to help her sons understand death. The interviews painted her as a devoted mother trying to heal her broken family. But behind the scenes, detectives were uncovering something very different: financial records, secret loans, deleted messages, life insurance policies, an alleged drug dealer, and evidence that prosecutors would later argue pointed to a carefully planned murder motivated by money. By 2026, after weeks of testimony and dozens of witnesses, a Utah jury convicted Kouri Richins of murdering her husband with a fatal dose of fentanyl. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and later filed an appeal that remains part of the ongoing legal process. This is the story of how investigators say a picture-perfect family unraveled, and how one of America's most shocking murder trials transformed a best-selling grief author into a convicted killer. To neighbors, Eric and Kouri Richins seem to have built the American dream. They lived in Kamas, Utah, a quiet mountain community surrounded by breathtaking scenery and expensive homes. The area attracted successful professionals looking for peaceful family life while remaining close to Park City and Salt Lake City. Eric Richins had earned a reputation as a careful businessman. Friends described him as practical, disciplined, and financially responsible. He worked in construction and property development and had spent years building wealth through real estate. Kouri was ambitious in her own right. She had become involved in buying, renovating, and selling homes. Together they appeared successful. Beautiful family, 3 young boys, luxury properties, growing businesses. On social media and in public, everything suggested they were thriving. But investigators would later argue that appearances hid mounting financial problems. As prosecutors pieced together bank statements, loan documents, and business records, they claimed Kouri's real estate ventures were collapsing under enormous debt. Every marriage has disagreements, but according to testimony presented during trial, the Richins marriage had begun changing long before Eric died. Friends later described increasing tension between the couple. Much of that tension centered on money. Prosecutors alleged Kouri was making significant financial decisions without Eric's knowledge. She reportedly borrowed large sums of money. Some loans carried extremely high interest. Others allegedly used property as collateral. Investigators said Eric had become increasingly concerned about the family's finances. According to testimony, he believed Kouri was taking risks that threatened everything they had built together. The prosecution later argued these financial disputes became one of the strongest motives in the case. Because if Eric stopped approving her business deals, if he discovered additional hidden debts, or if he changed his estate planning, Kouri stood to lose control over millions of dollars. Those questions would become central during the murder trial. One detail surprised many observers. Eric wasn't reckless. Evidence later introduced in court suggested he was extremely cautious with money and legal documents. He reportedly reviewed contracts carefully. He questioned investments. He monitored finances, and prosecutors argued he had begun taking steps to protect himself financially. According to court testimony, Eric had changed aspects of his estate planning before his death after learning about some of Kouri's financial decisions. Prosecutors argued those changes reduced what Kouri expected to inherit and became an important part of their theory of motive. The defense disputed the prosecution's interpretation of these events. Real estate can create enormous wealth. It can also create enormous losses. During trial, prosecutors described Kouri's business model as aggressive. She purchased homes, renovated them, then attempted to sell them for profit. When the housing market slowed and projects became more expensive, prosecutors argued the debts kept growing. Loan after loan, interest after interest, payment after payment. According to financial evidence presented at trial, prosecutors said Kouri owed hundreds of thousands of dollars and faced increasing pressure from lenders. They argued she believed her husband's death would provide access to life insurance proceeds and other financial resources. The defense challenged that conclusion and argued the state's financial theory overstated her situation. The prosecution would eventually tell jurors that financial desperation wasn't just background information. It was the reason they believed Eric had been killed. March 3, 2022. Eric had spent the day working. That evening, according to Kouri's account, she wanted to celebrate. She told investigators she prepared one of his favorite drinks, a Moscow Mule. The couple spent time together. Their 3 sons were asleep. Nothing appeared unusual. Hours later, Kouri said she checked on one of the children who had experienced a nightmare. When she eventually returned to the bedroom, Eric wasn't responding. Emergency responders arrived. Despite efforts to save him, Eric Richins was pronounced dead. Initially, there were more questions than answers. Eric was only 39 years old. He had no obvious injuries. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of violence inside the home. At first glance, the death appeared mysterious, but not necessarily criminal. That changed after the autopsy. Medical examiners determined Eric had died from fentanyl intoxication. Prosecutors later told jurors the amount detected was approximately 5 times a lethal dose and was consistent with illicit fentanyl taken by mouth. Suddenly, investigators weren't looking at a natural death. They were looking at a homicide. As detectives began asking more questions, Kouri Richins appeared publicly as a grieving widow. She comforted her children. She attended interviews. She spoke about loss. Eventually, she published a children's book intended to help families cope with grief. To many people, her story was inspiring. But investigators weren't convinced. Because while Kouri was telling the world about healing, police were quietly tracing financial records, reviewing phone data, searching for the source of the fentanyl, and uncovering evidence they believed pointed to a murder planned long before Eric ever drank that final Moscow Mule. As investigators dug deeper into the Richins marriage, they focused on something that had happened weeks before Eric's death. Prosecutors alleged that March 3, 2022 was not the first time someone had tried to poison Eric. According to the state's theory, there had been an earlier incident on Valentine's Day in February 2022. That evening, Kouri and Eric had dinner together. Prosecutors argued that after the meal, Eric became violently ill. He reportedly suffered severe symptoms and later told people close to him that he believed someone had tried to poison him. The prosecution contended that Eric specifically suspected his wife. The defense strongly disputed that interpretation, arguing there was no reliable proof that the illness was caused by poison and no medical evidence confirming fentanyl exposure during that earlier event. This alleged Valentine's Day incident would become an important part of the prosecution's narrative. They argued it showed planning rather than a spontaneous act. To convict Kouri of murder, prosecutors needed to convince jurors that Eric's death was intentional, and evidence suggesting an earlier attempt could support that theory. Investigators also uncovered evidence suggesting Eric had become increasingly cautious in the weeks before his death. Witnesses testified that he had begun taking steps to separate himself financially from Kouri. According to testimony presented in court, he questioned some of her business decisions. He became concerned about undisclosed loans. He wanted greater control over family finances. He updated aspects of his estate planning and financial arrangements. The prosecution argued these actions mattered because they threatened Kouri's financial interests. If Eric continued limiting her access to money, if he uncovered additional debts, or if he permanently changed who controlled his assets, The state's theory was that Kouri faced mounting financial pressure. The defense responded that disagreements over money are common in marriages and do not prove a motive to kill. Jurors would eventually have to decide whether these financial conflicts were ordinary marital disputes or part of a larger plan. Experienced homicide investigators often say, "Follow the money." In this case, prosecutors did exactly that. Bank records, loan documents, and business files painted a picture of mounting financial strain. According to evidence introduced at trial, Kouri had obtained substantial loans connected to real estate ventures, some without Eric's knowledge. Prosecutors argued that she was under pressure from lenders and that several projects were struggling financially. They also argued she expected to benefit financially if Eric died. The defense countered that the prosecution exaggerated her financial situation and that business debt alone does not establish guilt. Still, prosecutors told jurors that motive is rarely proven by one document or one witness. Instead, they asked the jury to consider the overall financial picture. Detectives now faced a critical question. If Eric had died from fentanyl, where did it come from? Eric had no known prescription for fentanyl. He had no history of illicit opioid use. Medical experts testified that the amount found in his system was extraordinarily high. That shifted investigators' focus to the drug's source. Phone records, text messages, digital communications. Every lead was examined. Eventually, detectives identified a person they believed could connect the investigation to the fatal drug. That witness would become one of the most controversial figures in the entire trial. One of the prosecution's most significant witnesses testified under immunity after reaching an agreement with the state. According to prosecutors, this witness said Kouri contacted him seeking powerful pain medication. He testified that the requests became more urgent over time. Eventually, prosecutors alleged, those requests escalated to fentanyl. The witness claimed he supplied fentanyl to Kouri shortly before Eric's death. The defense attacked his credibility from multiple angles. They pointed out that he had his own legal problems. They argued he had reasons to cooperate with prosecutors. They questioned inconsistencies in his statements. Throughout cross-examination, defense attorneys urged jurors to treat his testimony with caution. The prosecution acknowledged those credibility issues, but argued that the witness's account was supported by other evidence, including digital records and the broader timeline of events. Jurors would ultimately decide how much weight to give his testimony. Modern murder investigations rarely rely on a confession. Instead, they often depend on digital evidence. Investigators examined cell phone location data, text messages, call logs, internet searches, financial transactions, electronic communications. Prosecutors argued that these records helped reconstruct events leading up to Eric's death. While no single piece of digital evidence proved the case on its own, they told jurors that each record fit into a larger puzzle. The defense maintained that the state's interpretation of the data was speculative and that ordinary communications and phone activity should not be viewed as evidence of murder. While investigators continued gathering evidence, Kouri presented herself publicly as a grieving widow. She spoke about raising 3 boys without their father. Friends and supporters described her as heartbroken. Then, about a year after Eric's death, she published a children's book called Are You With Me? About helping children process grief after losing a parent. She appeared in television interviews promoting the book and discussing her family's loss. Those interviews drew national attention. But just weeks later, everything changed. Police arrested Kouri Richins and charged her with murdering Eric. The contrast between the public image of a grieving author and the allegations in the criminal case made headlines across the country. When investigators believed they had enough evidence, they moved forward. Kouri Richins was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including aggravated murder and related financial crimes. She denied the allegations. Her attorneys said she was innocent. The prosecution said the evidence would prove otherwise. The case quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in the United States. News outlets focused on the unusual combination of allegations: a successful real estate business, a children's grief book, a husband allegedly poisoned with fentanyl, a family torn apart, millions of dollars at stake. But the most important question still had no answer. Could prosecutors prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Kouri Richins intentionally murdered her husband? That answer would depend on the evidence presented in court. As the trial began, jurors heard from detectives, forensic experts, financial investigators, and witnesses who described the final weeks of Eric Richins' life. The prosecution laid out what it called a carefully planned murder motivated by financial gain. The defense insisted the state's case relied on assumptions, disputed witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence. After years of investigation, pretrial hearings, and legal arguments, the courtroom was finally set. On one side sat prosecutors, determined to prove that Kouri Richins had carefully planned her husband's death. On the other sat the defense, arguing that investigators had rushed to judgment and built a case on circumstantial evidence and unreliable witnesses. The judge reminded jurors of one of the most important principles in the American justice system. Kouri Richins was presumed innocent. The burden rested entirely on the prosecution. Not suspicion, not public opinion, not media coverage. The state had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Over the coming weeks, jurors would hear testimony from forensic scientists, medical experts, detectives, financial investigators, family members, and civilian witnesses. Each witness would reveal another piece of the story. One of the prosecution's earliest and most important witnesses was the medical examiner. The cause of death was clear. Eric Richins died from fentanyl intoxication. But prosecutors wanted the jury to understand something even more significant. Eric was not someone known to use fentanyl recreationally. He had no documented history suggesting opioid abuse. Medical experts explained that fentanyl is an extremely powerful synthetic opioid. It is estimated to be dozens of times stronger than heroin and many times stronger than morphine. Even tiny amounts can be deadly. According to testimony, the concentration found in Eric's body was consistent with a fatal overdose and far exceeded what would be expected from accidental exposure. The prosecution argued that the evidence pointed to a deliberate administration of fentanyl. The defense did not dispute that fentanyl caused Eric's death. Instead, they questioned whether the prosecution had proven who administered it. That distinction would become the central issue throughout the trial. The prosecution next focused on the last known hours of Eric's life. According to Kouri's own statements, she had prepared a Moscow Mule cocktail to celebrate the closing of a home sale. She described it as a surprise for her husband. Investigators found this detail significant. If Eric consumed fentanyl shortly before his death, the drink became one possible way it could have entered his system. However, prosecutors acknowledged that no direct forensic evidence showed fentanyl inside the glass itself. Instead, they relied on the surrounding circumstances. Kouri admitted preparing the drink. Eric became ill afterward. He died during the night. Medical experts testified that the timing was consistent with oral fentanyl ingestion. The defense argued that this theory relied on inference rather than direct physical proof. They reminded jurors that no one witnessed anyone placing fentanyl into the drink. The prosecution responded that murders committed in private are rarely witnessed. Instead, jurors should examine the complete chain of evidence. Investigators spent months reconstructing nearly every hour leading up to Eric's death. Phone records, home security information, witness interviews, financial transactions, digital communications. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a consistent timeline. Eric spent most of March 3 carrying out normal activities. Nothing suggested he planned to harm himself. Nothing suggested he sought illegal drugs. That evening, he returned home. He shared time with his wife. He drank the Moscow Mule she prepared. Hours later, he was dead. The prosecution argued there was no evidence that anyone else had access to Eric during the critical period before his death. The defense challenged parts of the timeline, arguing that the state's reconstruction depended on assumptions rather than eyewitness testimony. Modern investigations often rely as much on smartphones as fingerprints. Detectives analyzed thousands of digital records connected to the Richins family: text messages, call logs, location data, deleted communications, cloud backups, search activity. Prosecutors argued that the digital evidence showed increasing financial stress and communications related to obtaining drugs. The defense countered that phones record enormous amounts of ordinary activity and that investigators interpreted innocent communications in the most damaging possible way. Jurors were reminded repeatedly that digital evidence often requires interpretation. The same record can appear suspicious to one person and entirely innocent to another. Next came stacks of paperwork: loan agreements, mortgage records, property purchases, bank statements, credit records, business transactions. Financial investigators testified about real estate projects connected to Kouri. The prosecution argued that she had accumulated significant debt through investment properties and construction projects. According to the state, several loans had been obtained without Eric's knowledge. Jurors also heard testimony that Eric had begun discovering these financial issues before his death. The prosecution claimed this discovery increased conflict inside the marriage. If Eric restricted future borrowing, if he removed financial authority, if he separated assets, Kouri's financial situation could become much worse. The defense maintained that many successful entrepreneurs carry substantial debt while developing real estate, and that debt alone does not establish a motive for murder. One witness who attracted considerable attention was the family's housekeeper. She described the household and interactions she observed before Eric's death. The prosecution used her testimony to help establish changes in the relationship between Eric and Kouri. According to testimony, tensions within the marriage appeared to increase in the months leading up to Eric's death. The defense reminded jurors that household employees observe only limited parts of family life and cannot know everything happening inside a marriage. Still, prosecutors argued that multiple witnesses independently described similar changes in the relationship. They said these consistent observations strengthened the overall case. Perhaps no witness faced more intense questioning than the man prosecutors alleged supplied fentanyl. He testified that Kouri sought increasingly stronger drugs. Eventually, he said, she requested fentanyl. Defense attorneys challenged nearly every aspect of his testimony. Why should the jury trust someone involved in illegal drug activity? Had prosecutors offered favorable treatment? Were his memories influenced by the investigation? Could he be protecting himself? Cross-examination was lengthy and aggressive. The prosecution acknowledged that cooperating witnesses often have criminal histories. They argued that jurors should compare his testimony with other evidence rather than evaluating it in isolation. If his account matched phone records, if it matched financial records, if it matched the timeline, then, prosecutors argued, his testimony became much more credible. By this point in the trial, prosecutors had introduced dozens of exhibits. Yet one fact remained obvious. There was no surveillance video showing the poisoning. No confession, no eyewitness, no recording of anyone placing fentanyl into Eric's drink. The defense emphasized these absences repeatedly. They argued that the prosecution wanted jurors to fill gaps with speculation. Prosecutors answered with a different principle of law. Circumstantial evidence, they explained, can be just as powerful as direct evidence. A fingerprint is circumstantial. DNA is circumstantial. Financial motive is circumstantial. Phone records are circumstantial. When multiple independent facts point toward the same conclusion, prosecutors argued, those facts can collectively establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors would ultimately decide whether the evidence fit together or whether too many questions remained unanswered. As the prosecution rested, attention shifted to the defense. Defense attorneys now had the opportunity to challenge every major allegation. They questioned the credibility of witnesses. They attacked the investigation. They argued detectives developed tunnel vision early in the case and ignored alternative explanations. But prosecutors had one more category of evidence they believed would be especially persuasive: internet searches, private text messages, and statements they claimed revealed Kouri Richins' intentions long before Eric died. After weeks of testimony from investigators, forensic experts, financial analysts, and civilian witnesses, the prosecution rested its case. Now it was the defense's turn. From the very beginning, Kouri Richins' attorneys made one point clear: this case is built on assumptions. They argued prosecutors had woven together financial problems, circumstantial evidence, and testimony from questionable witnesses into a story, but that a convincing story is not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense reminded jurors that the burden of proof never shifts. Kouri Richins did not have to prove she was innocent. The state had to prove she was guilty. Every unanswered question, every inconsistency, and every missing piece of evidence, they argued, should create reasonable doubt. One of the first targets was the prosecution's key cooperating witness, the man who testified that he supplied fentanyl to Kouri. Defense attorneys carefully questioned his background. He had been involved in illegal drug activity. He faced serious legal consequences of his own, and he had agreed to cooperate with investigators. The defense suggested that he had every reason to tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear. If his testimony helped him, could it really be trusted? Jurors listened as attorneys pointed out inconsistencies between his earlier statements and later testimony. The prosecution acknowledged that cooperating witnesses are often imperfect, but they argued his testimony was supported by other evidence: phone records, communication history, the timing of events, the medical findings. According to prosecutors, no single witness proved the case. Instead, every witness supported the larger picture. Throughout the trial, defense attorneys returned to one powerful question: where is the direct evidence? No fingerprints on fentanyl packaging. No video showing poisoning. No eyewitness. No confession. No recording. No DNA linking Kouri to the drug itself. The defense argued these were not minor omissions. They were major gaps. The prosecution responded with a point judges often instruct juries about: the law does not require direct evidence. Many murder convictions are based entirely on circumstantial evidence. If every independent fact points toward the same conclusion, circumstantial evidence can be just as compelling. Jurors would later receive legal instructions explaining exactly how they should evaluate both forms of evidence. The prosecution introduced additional digital evidence that they argued reflected planning. Investigators reviewed phone activity, search history, text messages, financial communications, deleted records. Some evidence was admitted. Other proposed evidence became the subject of lengthy legal arguments outside the jury's presence. The defense challenged whether certain searches had been interpreted correctly. Could investigators know exactly who performed every search? Could another family member have used the device? Were prosecutors assigning sinister meaning to otherwise innocent activity? These questions became important because digital evidence can be persuasive, but only if jurors believe it accurately reflects a person's intent. Although the trial covered forensic science and digital evidence, prosecutors repeatedly returned to the same subject: money. Jurors reviewed documents showing business debts, loan applications, and real estate transactions. The prosecution argued that Kouri faced mounting financial pressure and that Eric had become increasingly aware of it. They also presented evidence that Eric had changed elements of his financial planning before his death. According to prosecutors, those changes threatened Kouri's financial future. The defense viewed the same evidence differently. They argued many real estate investors operate with substantial debt. Borrowing money is not a crime. Owning investment properties is not suspicious. Financial disagreements happen in countless marriages. None of that proves murder. The jury had to decide whether the financial evidence showed motive or simply ordinary business risk. One of the most unusual aspects of the case received widespread media attention. After Eric's death, Kouri wrote and promoted a children's book titled "Are You With Me?" The The prosecution did not argue that writing the book was itself evidence of murder. However, it became part of the public narrative surrounding the case. Television interviews showed Kouri describing grief, healing, and helping children cope with the loss of a parent. Then, shortly afterward, she was arrested. The dramatic contrast between those interviews and the criminal charges fueled intense public interest. Defense attorneys cautioned against allowing emotion or media coverage to influence the verdict. Jurors were instructed to decide the case solely on the evidence presented in court. As testimony came to an end, both sides had one final opportunity to speak directly to the jury. The prosecution argued that each piece of evidence reinforced the next. Financial pressure, marital conflict, the alleged effort to obtain fentanyl, the fatal Moscow Mule, medical testimony, digital records, witness testimony. They urged jurors to consider the evidence as a whole rather than evaluating each fact in isolation. The defense urged jurors to do exactly the opposite. They argued that when each piece of evidence is examined carefully, uncertainty remains. No eyewitness, no confession, no direct proof that Kouri placed fentanyl into Eric's drink, no physical evidence showing exactly how the drug was administered. According to the defense, suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not enough for a criminal conviction. Before deliberations began, the judge explained the law. Jurors were reminded, the defendant is presumed innocent. The prosecution bears the burden of proof. A conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors must consider all admitted evidence fairly and impartially. They must not allow sympathy, speculation, or media attention to influence their decision. These instructions would guide every discussion inside the jury room. After reviewing weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury reached its decision. Inside a silent courtroom, the verdict was read. The jury found Kouri Richins guilty of murdering Eric Richins. They also convicted her on related charges connected to the state's case. For Eric's family, the verdict marked the end of a long legal battle. For Kouri's defense team, it marked the beginning of another. They announced their intention to challenge the conviction through the appellate process. The case was far from over. Although the jury had spoken, important legal questions remained. Defense attorneys argued that errors during the proceedings affected the fairness of the trial. Prosecutors maintained that the verdict was supported by overwhelming evidence. Then came sentencing, and afterward, the appeals, the legal motions, and new developments that continued making headlines well into 2026. After listening to weeks of testimony, examining hundreds of exhibits, and hearing arguments from both sides, the case was finally in the jury's hands. The courtroom emptied. Families waited. Attorneys reviewed their notes one last time. Outside the courthouse, television crews prepared for what everyone knew would be a historic verdict. Inside the jury room, 8 jurors began reviewing the evidence. They considered the medical testimony, the financial records, the digital evidence, the testimony from the alleged fentanyl supplier, the prosecution's theory of motive, and the defense's repeated argument that the state had failed to prove who actually administered the fatal dose. The question before them wasn't whether Eric Richins had been murdered. The medical evidence had established that he died from a lethal fentanyl overdose. The real question was whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Kouri Richins was responsible. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. The courtroom filled once again. Kouri Richins stood beside her attorneys. Eric Richins' family sat quietly nearby. When the clerk began reading the verdicts, the room was silent. The jury found Kouri Richins guilty of aggravated murder. They also found her guilty of attempted aggravated murder for the alleged Valentine's Day poisoning, forgery, and 2 counts of insurance fraud. For prosecutors, it was a complete victory. For the defense, it marked the beginning of the appeals process. 2 months later, the courtroom filled once again for sentencing. The date carried painful symbolism. It would have been Eric Richins' 44th birthday. Family members delivered emotional victim impact statements. Friends described the loss Eric's children would carry for the rest of their lives. The prosecution argued that Kouri had not only taken Eric's life, but had shattered the future of 3 young boys. Defense attorneys asked the court to consider mitigating factors and argued that Kouri continued to maintain her innocence. Then the judge spoke. Judge Richard Mrazek reviewed the evidence presented during trial. He said the jury's verdict demonstrated that this was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate crime. He also noted that the jury had concluded there had been an earlier attempted poisoning before the fatal incident. According to the judge, the evidence showed planning, deception, and financial motive. He ultimately concluded that Kouri Richins posed too great a danger to society to ever be released. Judge Mrazek imposed the maximum punishment available: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition to the life sentence for aggravated murder, Richins also received sentences on the remaining convictions, including attempted aggravated murder, forgery, and insurance fraud, to be served according to the court's sentencing order. For Eric's family, the sentence brought a measure of closure. For Kouri, it meant she would spend the rest of her life in prison unless a future appeal succeeded. Before sentencing concluded, Kouri Richins addressed the court. She maintained her innocence. She told the judge she did not kill her husband. Speaking about her 3 sons, she asked them not to give up on her and promised she would continue fighting the conviction. She made one thing very clear: she intended to appeal. Her statement reflected the same position she had maintained since her arrest, that the jury had reached the wrong conclusion and that she believed the conviction would eventually be overturned. Within weeks of sentencing, Kouri's legal team formally filed a notice of appeal. The case was transferred to the Utah Court of Appeals, where appellate judges will review whether any legal errors occurred during the trial that could justify reversing the convictions or ordering a new trial. It is important to understand what an appeal is and what it is not. An appeal is not a second trial. The appellate court will not decide whether Kouri is innocent or guilty based on new evidence. Instead, the judges will review the trial record to determine whether the law was applied correctly. Possible issues on appeal could include whether certain evidence should have been admitted or excluded, whether the jury received proper legal instructions, whether any prosecutorial or judicial errors affected the fairness of the proceedings, whether the evidence presented at trial was legally sufficient to support the convictions. As of now, the appeal remains pending, and the convictions and life sentence remain in effect. The Kouri Richins case became one of the most talked-about criminal trials in recent years for several reasons. First, there was the shocking contrast between public image and the prosecution's allegations. A mother, a successful real estate investor, an author of a children's book about grief. Those were not the characteristics many people associated with a calculated murder. Second, the alleged motive was striking. Rather than a crime of passion, prosecutors described a case driven by financial pressure, debt, insurance policies, and control over money. Third, the evidence relied heavily on a combination of forensic science, financial records, digital communications, and witness testimony. There was no confession, no surveillance video, no eyewitness to the poisoning. Instead, jurors were asked to evaluate whether many independent pieces of circumstantial evidence formed one convincing picture. Ultimately, they concluded that they did. Today, Kouri Richins remains incarcerated under a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Her conviction has not been overturned. Her appeal is moving through Utah's appellate courts. Separately, she also continues to face additional unresolved financial crime allegations that were not part of the murder trial. Those proceedings are distinct from her appeal of the murder conviction. For Eric Richins' family, the legal process may continue for years, but the jury's verdict has already answered the central question posed during the trial. The court found that Eric Richins was not the victim of an unexplained overdose. It found that he was murdered. Some true crime cases leave behind unanswered questions. Others end with a confession. The Kouri Richins case did neither. Instead, It became a story about evidence, about whether financial records, forensic science, witness testimony, and digital footprints could prove a murder that no one claimed to have witnessed. After hearing every witness and reviewing every exhibit, the jury concluded they could. Still, the legal system allows another layer of review. The appellate courts will now examine the trial to determine whether it was conducted fairly and in accordance with the law, whether those convictions will remain intact, or whether future legal proceedings will change the outcome remains to be seen. But one fact is no longer in dispute. On March 4, 2022, Eric Richins lost his life. The case that followed transformed a private family tragedy into one of the most closely watched murder prosecutions in America. And it serves as a reminder that behind every headline, every courtroom argument, and every legal filing are real people whose lives were changed forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth, evidence-based true crime stories.